Welcome to this special interview with the Prime Minister of Tibetan government in exile, Dr. Lobsang Sangay. As you might be aware that the Chinese Premier Li is visiting Delhi and he's going to be here for 3 days. We're going to be listening to a lot of other things about India and China, incursion, water issue, but perhaps one of the oldest issues between India and China, the Tibet issue, perhaps will not be covered as much as we expect. To talk about it, we have the Prime Minister of the government in exile. Dr. Sangay, to begin with, the Premier of China, the PRC, People's Republic of China is here. Has there been any sort of contact between the government in exile here and the Chinese government lately?
No formal contact as of yet.
Okay.
Unfortunately, from our side, we want to resolve the issue of Tibet peacefully through dialogue. And then hopefully there will be a dialogue. That's what we are hoping for.
But tell me, you mentioned no formal contact as such. I knew because that few years back there were envoys of His Holiness who had traveled to Beijing and tried to sort of start some sort of interaction between both the parties. Informally, do the Chinese give any vibes that they are interested in resolving this issue?
Kunalji, you're right. From 2002 to January of 2010, there were 9 rounds of formal dialogues between the envoys of the Dalai Lama and the Chinese counterpart. But the last meeting was on January of 2010.
Okay.
It's been more than 3 years. There has been no dialogue. Not for the lack of efforts from our side. We are ready to engage in dialogue anytime, at anywhere, but no formal dialogue as of yet. Now, informally, I mean, it's a well-known fact that Chinese Buddhists come to India, some journalists, some scholars come to India, and some of them make it their way to Dharamsala, where we have interactions with them. And as we always say, we are quite transparent in what we do and what we say. And so anyone from China comes and they want to understand the Tibetan issue, we are willing to have dialogue with them at any level. So that way we have met people in Dharamsala or in other places wherever I go also. When I give talks, let's say in the US and some universities or some think tanks, they do come and some even ask questions, and we just give them our version and our clarifications.
But where is it stuck? You mentioned that there have been 10 formal rounds. Has there been a breaking point that such interaction hasn't continued, or did you sort of reach somewhere in these 10 rounds?
From our side, we made ourselves very clear what do we mean by the middle way policy, which is neither repression that is going on in Tibet, nor separation from PRC, but rather in the middle, where we want to have genuine autonomy for Tibetans, so that with Tibetan administration, administering all the Tibetan areas with similar culture, language, environment, and economy. And then we also have a document called Memorandum of Genuine Autonomy for Tibetans, in which we have clearly laid out all the details of the genuine autonomy.
So, but the Chinese are not even agreeing to this. What is their contention?
That is the most unfortunate and the puzzling part.
Okay.
From our side, essentially what we say is, if the Chinese government implements their own laws, we will take that as genuine autonomy.
Okay.
What Tibetans are seeking is within the framework of the Chinese constitution, what is written there. And they refuse to implement their own laws and refuse to continue the dialogue. So it's a bit puzzling for us. But that's, they do raise some issues, like the size of Tibet and whether there is some hidden independence or not. But all these are not true, because when we say these are the provisions of the Chinese constitution and these are the rights already clearly illustrated in the Chinese constitution, if you implement those laws, we will take that as autonomy. For example, Tibetan language not only be used but should be encouraged.
Okay.
So that's what we say. What we say is now, this is what the law says, and implement it. Instead of implementing it, they are violating that law. For example, Tibetan language is not the medium of instruction at the university level, at the high school level, at the middle school level. Tibetan language is also not commonly used in the administrative matters in the government agencies. So instead of not only not using, far less encouraging, Tibetan language is discouraged and disuse. So that is the obstacle from our side. Now Chinese government ought to explain how asking, let's say, that implementation of that provision amounts to hidden independence.
So in that sense, what you mean is the cultural aspect seems to be the problem in that sense, because what you are asking is perhaps more cultural autonomy and assertion of the Tibetan identity, which is something that the Chinese government don't seem to be happy implementing.
No, not just culture, the economic aspect, there's environment, and essentially administrative mechanism through which all the Tibetans are included in one structure. That is essentially what we are saying, because Tibetans in not just Tibet Autonomous Region, but in Qinghai, Sichuan, Yunnan, and Gansu, all are Tibetans.
That's another point of contention, isn't it?
That is
what they consider Tibet and what do you consider Tibet?
Our definition of Tibet is where Tibetans live.
Okay.
For example, my late father was from Lithang, which at present is in Sichuan province.
Okay.
His Holiness Dalai Lama is from Amdo area, which is presently in Qinghai.
Okay.
Now, if you don't consider this area as Tibetans and don't consider these people as Tibetans, then how do you define Tibetan and how do you define Tibet? So that should not also be a contention, because Xinjiang Autonomous Region has 99% of Uyghur people living in one area. Zhuang Autonomous Region, 95% of Zhuang living in one area. It's only Tibet or Tibetan area where more than 50% are outside than in Tibet Autonomous Region.
Let's move to the leadership. We've seen a change in the Chinese leadership. Very interestingly, the Premier's first visit, Premier Lee's first visit has been to India, and then he's going to Pakistan after this. So he's giving a lot of importance to the neighborhood. How do you see the new leadership? Do you think there's going to be a change in the way they approach the Tibetan issue, the last lot?
India and China are two of the biggest countries in Asia, and also two of the largest population in the whole world.
Yeah.
So peace between these two countries are very important. Hence, India and China ought to have peaceful relationship. So in that sense, Premier Li Keqiang visit to India is significant. But I hope, Premier Li Keqiang will see the democracy and diversity of India, where different language, different culture, different administration function quite smoothly. And also, in fact, it's the democracy that binds India together. So giving equal rights and treating everybody equally is very important. These are some of the important ideas that Chinese leadership could ponder in considering the situation in Tibet.
But in terms of Tibet as an issue between India and China, do you expect more from the Indian government?
As you see in the bilateral discussion, when they talk about the border, when they talk about water, it's essentially was border between India and Tibet, and also water that flow from Tibet. For example, Brahmaputra River, Salween Indus River, the Satluj River, Yangtze River, Yellow River, Mekong, all flow from Tibet. So in Tibet is the source of 10 major rivers of Asia. So it's vital for India, vital for South Asia, and vital for Asia as a whole. Even the monsoon of Asia is affected because of Tibet, because of high altitude. The mist that rises from the ocean forms cloud and hits the Tibetan plateau and forms monsoon. So the delay in monsoon or early monsoon are very much affected by what is happening in Tibet. In that sense, Tibet is vital. And we know the border dispute. So in 1914, the similar agreement was signed between British India and Tibet. And hence, a major portion of Tibet and India is demarcated as a McMahon line. So anywhere from 3,500, some say even 2,500 to 4,000 kilometers long border. It essentially was Tibet. So restoring the traditional guardianship or steward of Tibetan people is vital also for India, because there was hardly a sepoy or army personnel at the border at that time. Now you have to spend billions of dollars. And also for China, Tibet served as a very peaceful buffer zone to keep two of the largest populated countries in the world apart. So solving the issue of Tibet could help stabilize and bring peace in the area as well.
But coming back to my original question, you nicely went in with the background. But are you happy with India's current position on Tibet or what it's doing on Tibet?
As we Tibetans always say, "Hum log yahan mehman hai," we are guests here. So whatever the host provides us, we take it gracefully, and we have to. So we have no complaints. But given a choice, obviously, Tibet is linked to India's security, hence vitally important for India's security. So it becomes natural that two countries talk on the issue of Tibet. China says Tibet is one of their core issues, and for India too, for environmentally, even economically, because millions of people survive on downstream, on fishery and agriculture, and geopolitically and spiritually also, because Buddhism that we practice is very much Indian-based Nalanda tradition in Tibet. So that way, I think Tibet is very much linked to India's security and as a whole. So we, if given a choice, we wish India also recognize Tibet as one of the core issues.
In a statement I think you gave during the incursion controversy, you said that India-China face off as Tibet is no more a buffer zone. So perhaps it also sort of indicates the importance of Tibet in that sense in terms of security aspect.
Yes, restoring Tibet as a buffer zone and giving genuine autonomy to Tibetans, will lessen suspicion on both sides, primarily from the Chinese side.
But defense would still be under Beijing, won't it, even if you have autonomy?
But when you have an element of suspicion, then I think you see more activities on the defense related aspect. But if the suspicion is less, because they know, the Chinese government knows that Tibetans in Tibet are not just not content, but resentful of the Chinese government policies. Hence they see that Tibetans in Tibet are resisting. In that sense, they are suspicious of the Tibetan people, and Tibetans are also justifiably resentful, and then they're resenting in very tragic forms like self-immolation. Hence, because of that suspicion, they also have element of defense mechanism as such. But when the suspicion can be lessened, and especially if both India and China agrees that to maintain Tibet as a peaceful area, then I think the border dispute could be lessened as well.
There's a question that I want to take up with India and Tibet as an international issue. But before that, you mentioned self-immolation. Can you assure the Indians that you're not going to have anything on the Indian land? Or is it difficult for you to guarantee?
From our side, you know, as a leader, what you can do is ask people not to resort to self-immolation in the land of India. That we have done. And then also discourage Tibetans inside Tibet not to resort to drastic actions, including self-immolation. That we have done. So when we discourage Tibetans from resorting to drastic actions, including self-immolation inside Tibet, all the more outside, what we say is India included, those Tibetans in exile, we are in free world. We can protest and demonstrate in various forms because we have freedom of speech. And in Tibet, sadly, Tibetans resort to self-immolation because there are no other forms or space for protest. If you have any form of protest, be it pasting a poster on the wall or, you know, His Holiness Dalai Lama's photograph, even shout human rights, you go to prison. The fact there's no space, hence they're resorting to such actions, yes.
Okay. Tibet is an international issue. I mean, some Tibetans off the record always tell me that even for India, it's just one of the many political sort of exchange. Tibet becomes almost an issue to sort of negotiate with China. I mean, of course, we saw the last administration in US, President Bush's had honored Dalai Lama in the Congress. But at the end of the day, when it comes to the real issue, Tibet just becomes one of the chip in the block, you know, in many sense, and people don't seem to be serious. Do you really think that countries like India, of course you said hum yahan mehman hai, but America or in European countries, are they really serious about resolving the Tibetan issue, or for them it's another sort of chip to bargain when it comes to dealing with this great giant called China?
Well, it depends how you look at it, whether glass is half full or half empty.
Well, it is Narendra Modi or Rahul Gandhi then.
Because it depends. Now, if you read, because, you know, partly being Tibetan and Buddhist, you know, we tend to be a bit hopeful all the time and see goodness in human nature. So we tend to see, you know, glass is half full. In that sense, what the US government is doing, or some of the European countries have done, passed resolutions on the issue of Tibet, raised issue whenever they could, despite the pressure from the Chinese government and strong urging not to do so, because I've experienced that myself. Wherever I travel, Chinese embassies are quite busy, you know. Despite all that, people do come meet and raise the issue of Tibet. Some with the Chinese leadership itself are all appreciated by Tibetans, you know. So we wish the governments do more. We wish governments speak quite strongly, but nonetheless, whatever they have done, and we are appreciative.
So in many sense, is the rising China a threat to the Tibetan issue? Because the clout that it has is primarily because of its economic strength.
You know, it depends how you look at it, actually. One theory is that when China becomes more confident, then it will be able to resolve, or will have the confidence to resolve all these you know, conflicts. If that is the case, it's to be seen. Okay. Some say when China is weak, or it needs more international help, then that's the time when it will resolve the issue of Tibet. So there are a couple of examples. In early 80s, Hong Kong and Macau was resolved. That's one area. And then they continue to resolve some you know, issues within China themselves. So rising China or not, Tibet is a major issue for China. Tibet issue is this black dot on their image that they cannot erase without actually solving the issue of Tibet. So I was just there in Germany, you know. And then they were saying, you know, looking at the history, how they feel now, the lessons that they have learned, and China should not, you know, walk that path and destroy a rich civilization like Tibet, and you know, really trying to synthesize or assimilate Tibetan people into Chinese fold, which they will not be able to do which also will unnecessarily bring them bad image. So they are rising nonetheless, and then what kind of rise you are going to have and what kind of respect you are going to receive are two different things. You can rise economically, you can rise militarily, but if you want respect with a rise, you ought to show respect to people. You ought to show respect to Tibetans. So in that sense, Tibet is a test of the Chinese government rise.
Lastly, leadership issue. This talk about Dalai Lama growing old, of course he has sort of created the post of the political office, so you are elected Prime Minister of the government in exile. But what after Dalai Lama? This talks goes on. Who's going to take up the leadership? Of course, there is now clearly you've taken up the political leadership, but let's be frank, compared to him, it's difficult for you to again get the international sort of respectability and acceptability. So what happens to the what happens to the Tibetan, the movement post Dalai Lama?
Well, His Holiness is 77 years old, but very healthy.
Absolutely, he travels a lot.
He travels a lot. He maintains 12+ hours schedule, and I have been with him few times. We get exhausted by following his schedule, and he, actually, implements those schedules. So he will live very long. He's very healthy. He gets up at 3:30 in the morning, and does meditation and prayer for 5 hours. So we will see him for a very, very long time. Nonetheless, he himself has, commented about 15th Dalai Lama. So we will have a 15th Dalai Lama.
And would that 15th Dalai Lama be outside China? He said it could even be a woman.
15th Dalai Lama will be outside China.
Okay.
He or she, most likely he, because the idea of reincarnation is that the person comes back to continue the mission and vision of the previous Lama. If the previous Lama leaves or passes away in exile or outside of Tibet or China, then he will be born outside to continue the mission from where he left. So it's natural.
But tell me technically, so if the new Dalai Lama is chosen, the 15th Dalai Lama, always going to be a young kid. So still there is going to be a vacuum for leadership in that sense.
Now, the political leadership, we have institutionalized the leadership, we have democratized the leadership, so that we have. Now, spiritual leadership, His Holiness has said, it could be either through emanation, reincarnation, or selection. Selection means like all the high lamas will meet, like the cardinals, they'll select the Pope. Reincarnation means obviously one has to pass away and then reborn. Emanation is he could designate his own successor while he's alive. So all these three options are on the table.
So we're certainly going to see a continuation of the leadership of the movement.
Absolutely, but it won't be necessary, because before that we will
find a solution.
Yes, find a solution and aspirations.
Are you hopeful?
I'm absolutely hopeful. Not only hopeful, I do believe. That's why I am in Bharat, not in America. After spending 16 years in the U.S. in Harvard Law School, I came back. I'm believing that our day will come. It will come soon.
But how soon?
Very
in your
soon.
tenure?
Of course. That's what I believe. Yes, I know. That's the belief one ought to have. That's the hope one ought to have. That's what one should strive for.
Thanks a lot for talking to your Prime Minister.
Thank you very much.